opportunity, but it should help us to bring these companies who are looking for ways to get things done both faster and cheaper. But certainly that initial piece of how fast you can get through the regulatory piece, the IRBs, and again, we had the experience of having to go province to province to get approvals, even for small changes in protocols. It's complex. It's minimum 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of the change, or whether it's a new application or a revision. 6 months is, I think, way too long. I mean, it's just unbelievable that we're at that point still today. Hey everybody, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE, the Canadian Healthcare Podcast. Again, today we actually have with us our usual friend of the podcast, Alex Dickinson from the Genomics podcast. He is, of course, the LinkedIn provocateur, and he is, of course, also I call him the Dawn of Diagnostics. So welcome again, Alex, for helping us with our July roundup, which, of course, there's a ton of stuff happening in the July just last month. It's like crazy how fast things are moving nowadays. So maybe let's go with the first topic. So this is very, Canadian centric, but we'll make it bigger on meta point here. So the Canadian government put together a task force called the Pharmaceutical and Life Sciences Sector Task Force to look into how we can improve the healthcare and innovation infrastructure, life sciences infrastructure in Canada. One specific problem that they called out is something that we're all very familiar with, is clinical trials. For maybe a lack of better words, our Canadian clinical trial networks or infrastructure are, let's say, a lot to be desired. So their recommendation is investment in that specific area. So maybe I'll go to you first, Kostas, because you wrote quite a few pieces on this topic on LinkedIn. So maybe you can share some of your thoughts, maybe especially around the clinical trial piece.
Absolutely. So, the task force, really, the idea was, how do you encourage growth in the Canadian life sciences sector, right? I mean, that was really the fundamental question. They tried to address questions around regulatory issues in terms of the how long does it take to get a drug approved? How long does it take to get a product reimbursed? Is it being reimbursed at the right level? All these things. Well, one of the things that they identified also was the lack of a really strong clinical trial environment. I think Canada has always been a really solid, or had been a really solid market for conducting clinical trials. I'd say we are from a clinical standards, the G5, the US, Canada, Australia, you could see all being very similar in terms of, the quality of care and the level of care that would be given in that environment. So it would make sense that you'd want to do clinical trials there, but we're just not seeing it. And I think you and I have had this experience when we worked at Exactis, looking at a lot of the structural questions, really, something as simple as trying to find patients that match your criteria. There are countries where they have centralized databases where you can find these patients. Not Canada. We have specific privacy policies in place that prohibit the ability to actually do this in a really efficient manner. Hospitals are kind of competing against one another. There's competing, just trials within a center especially for rare diseases, or those that require biomarkers. And I think there's that last piece, the lack of the kind of testing you see in a market like the US, where those biomarkers are commonly available within a patient's records. You don't see that here in Canada as often. So it's kind of tough. So there were recommendations to try to improve the infrastructure, so around the data piece, and trying to figure out how to do coordination a little bit better, and making it a lot easier to get trials up and running. So that's the sort of the regulatory sort of barriers to getting trials up and running in Canada. All good things. I don't know how far we're actually going to go down this path. Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, interesting contrast, right? Since we're all Commonwealthians here, Australia has done really, really well in recent years on clinical trials. And I just ran a quick comparison around structure, what they did versus Canada, and it seems like it's two things. They made big changes to the regulatory environment. So the ethics committee approves in Australia, but you don't have to. You simply notify the federal authorities. You don't look for approval for them, and so that starts a study in 5 to 6 weeks. And in Canada, there's a 30-day Health Canada review, but it's apparently very fragmented. It's province by province, hospital by hospital ethics committees, so very unstructured. And the other thing is Australia offered a crazy refundable R&D credit of 43.5% for trials that are happening inside Australia. So, big financial incentive and big speed incentive. And given that clinical trials are by reputation expensive and slow, it turns out to be really big. And, it's just Australia's been punching above its weight. I hear about them in trials all the time. And this seems to be the primary reason.
Yeah, and just some data to back that up, Alex, just so you're aware. Oh, sorry, Kostas, but I did a little bit of a just analysis of clinical trials run in different countries, right? And actually, Canada in some ways punches above our weight as well, right? Of course, the largest, like, it's US, and then China is very high up there. It's surprising there's other countries like Spain that do quite well as well. And at some point in time, Canada, I think, was like third or fourth or fifth, something along those lines, right? And Australia basically caught up to Canada in the last 5 years. So Australia is like way behind, and then somehow they just leapfrog way ahead. And it speaks a lot to, I think, the changes that you're talking about, Alex, around regulatory, around, you said, what was the other thing? You said regulatory was
it's a tax rebate.
Seems like the big
tax
money. Yes,
I think it ends up being. I think that's basically half off your clinical trial. Is the way to think about it.
But the other thing that I think, Kostas is going to probably jump into, but is around the diagnostics. So in Australia, I think in 5 years ago, they put together a program. I forgot what it was exactly called. I think it's run by an organization called Omni or something along those lines, around basically giving a larger panel of NGS tests, which boils down to you can find more biomarkers for patient. You can basically test a patient, figure out, okay, do they actually qualify for this specific clinical trial or not, right? And that's what a lot of the big pharma are very interested in right now, is these populations are stratified by some form of biomarker, right? Sorry, Kostas, go ahead.
No, I think the biomarker is a huge piece, especially in something like oncology. Couldn't agree more. And until we get to the point where those at least the biomarkers that are currently required, if not more, like sort of thinking a little bit into the future, what's the next wave of biomarkers, until they're part of our standard panels in hospital before diagnosis, we're not catching up in those categories. It just, no company is going to pay to screen like 100 or 200 patients to find one. That's been the issue in Canada, right? But the piece I wanted to go back and touch on a little bit was the financial piece. I think that's a massive, massive inducement for trials, especially smaller companies. I think some of the larger multinationals, but anyone who's looking to make their dollars go further. In Canada, we do have SHRED, right, which is a huge boon for early phases, right, early phase research. But it does not, as far as I understand it, include the clinical phase. And that's one of the areas that I think there is some movement. Certainly, I think hospitals would like to see that as an opportunity, but it should help us to bring these companies who are looking for ways to get things done both faster and cheaper. But certainly that initial piece of how fast you can get through the regulatory piece, the IRBs. And again, we had the experience of having to go province to province to get approvals, even for small changes in protocols. It's complex. It's minimum 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of the change or whether it's a new application or a revision. 6 months is, I think, way too long. I mean, it's just unbelievable that we're at that point still today.
Yeah, speaking about, maybe taking a step back and maybe thinking about just competitiveness in clinical trials, meaning, let's say, between different countries or different institutes. So there is this idea of costs, right? Talking about the rebates, but maybe everyone just gives rebates, right? So then that's not unique anymore. Let's say the regulatory framework, you make RRBs or REBs, right? These almost like basically documentation or applications to be able to do these type of clinical trials, that becomes streamlined in every single country, right? Then it's like, what's the next thing that would differentiate a country or an institute? So we talked about biomarker testing, like this idea of doing wide genomics testing so that you basically stratify populations by more minute specific differences between them, and you find the ones that you think this specific difference is going to be the difference that actually reacts or is more affected by that specific drug, right? So do you think that is where people are going to push even harder into, Alex, maybe pass over to you, like where's the next innovation, I guess, in the clinical trials to be competitive?
I think it's well, I think AI is interesting. I don't know if that's getting too far off topic. I am a co-founder in a company called Right.ai, where we're using basically emerging AI technology to speed up the trial selection process. There's over 100,000 clinical trial sites worldwide, and so picking the right trial site, and that's many things, right? It's access to the right group of patients, right? Particular pathology, perhaps, particular the right word, the right racial background or racial mix, right, for who you're trying to include in the trial, and whether those trial sites perform well, right? Do they actually get it done, or did someone just hold up their hand and say, "I'm a clinical trial site," right? And so sorting through that with AI turns out to be, a very valuable thing. And I was really struck, sort of in the same sense, this week by an announcement from ICON, which is one of the biggest CROs in the world, happens to be headquartered in Ireland, and they announced a deal with Anthropic. And I feel like this is the first big deal that I've seen, comprehensive deal between a CRO and one of the foundational model companies. And they're applying it to doing real-time enrollment risk detection. So risk detection as a person comes in, optimizing the protocols being used in a clinical trial, integrating the clinical trial into the various informatics systems that perhaps the Pharma is using and the CRO is using. So really a kind of a huge deal. And ICON has 40,000 employees worldwide. And so I think that maybe is the next big accelerant, just in the sense, and the reason we did right is just the awareness that there's a huge amount of filing and tracking infrastructure or overhead used in clinical trials. So clearly, the more you can automate out of that, then the less expensive they become, and ideally, the faster they run.
Yeah, I was waiting for how long it would take us to mention the two letters AI in the podcast. It seems like with every podcast nowadays, right? It's like almost like a drinking game at this point in time. But because it's actually, Alex brings up the AI, but what that really, to me, I guess what I understand from that is aggregating data and then making sense of the data, and these various intelligent
Yeah.
machines are able to better make sense of this type of data. And in some ways we were trying to do some of that, not the AI part, but more the data collection part around at Exactis, around real world evidence, right? Real world data. Do you
Yeah.
think that's going to be really the moat, the innovators kind of to that'll be the innovation that attracts more clinical trials to either a specific site or a specific country, is that they just have more data about that specific population? Kostas, what do you think?
Yes. Yeah. No. I think being able to identify those patients is going to be the important thing, and it, that's the end point, right? That's what you want. You want to be able to say, come to Canada, come to our sites, because we can identify the specific kind of patients that you have. We have a fairly diverse population, so that whoever you need, they probably exist here in Canada. So it's a good single place to come to get a good cross section of patients. But that said, you have to backtrack from there and say, what do you need? Well, you need good, clean data. You need it to be accessible and aggregatable so that you can do this fairly quickly. And we don't have that, right? So you don't have the markers that are required by a lot of studies today. So that's one knock on this. And so you need to do more testing. That testing needs to be in a format where, whether you can do it within an institution, or there's some way to in a single portal actually surveil all research hospitals, whatever that looks like, you have to be able to do that, and that doesn't exist today. And to do that is, it's another 10 years at least in Canada. There are some hospitals, if you're talking like a UHN, they've got that in place already. Are they opening it up? I don't know. I think we can ask maybe the CEO there how they see becoming part of the Canadian ecosystem, or if they are going it alone as a monolith, having made their own investments. That's a question we can't answer. But it all comes back to, is the data available so that AIs can actually go in and do the picking, do the risk assessment, and say, these are you need 400 patients, here's 600, go through the list. These are the best options for you to have. That's I think what you need. But right now, and I think you'll remember, the privacy policy wouldn't even allow the folks who were recruiting for us to actually go talk to patients, right? It had to go through the doctor, because doctor-patient confidentiality. Their data is available. You can identify them in a clinic, but you still can't go and ask that patient, hey, listen, you're ideal for this study. So things like that, they're small, details that need to change. But until the data is right, until the procedures are in place to really allow you to actually identify patients and to approach them, this is not working. And I think there's a last piece that we haven't talked about yet. Doctors in Canada are super overworked right now. I don't know how many physicians you can go to in Canada and say, like, hey, do you have a lot of like slack in your day? I think the answer is going to be like, absolutely not. So adding more clinical trials to their docket, I don't know how that's manageable in the current environment. So you have to add capacity into the question as well.
Yeah, I guess that's where AI is going to come in and save us all. But all joking aside, I know we joke a little bit, but actually, in some ways, it probably actually does make sense. Like that seems like one area where a computer could churn through a lot of data and then identify the right patients. Kind of does make sense. But we did speak about testing quite a few times here, and testing in some ways is like data generation, right? And recently, there is a lot of movement in the diagnostic testing space. So I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of the companies that reported. There's actually a ton. Pretty much every single company reported their Q2 results in the last maybe two, three weeks, like a Guardant. Revenue, 44% growth. Natera, just reported last night, 38% growth. Caris, 45% growth. billion to 1, 64% growth. Tempest, 22% growth. Even companies that make the tools like Illumina, we've had a little bit back and forth there, Alex, around Illumina, is 9.5% growth. So all these diagnostic companies just killing it at this point in time, even the tool makers. Maybe my question for you, Alex, maybe to start things off is because we had a little back and forth about Illumina. I guess not to go into fully a debate, but the idea around who's going to actually be the one that gains the most margin. Is it the app company, in this case, like a Guardant, like a Natera, or is it going to be a diagnostic tool company like a Illumina or like a Roche, right, with their sequencer, or Element with their sequencer? Because in the past, it was, I think arguably it was Illumina that made probably the largest margin and had the greatest growth of all the organizations. But nowadays it seems like the tables have flipped. Like how do you think about those competitive dynamics at this point?
Great timing. I just before we got on this call, I put up a post about exactly that. And what struck me was just looking over some stock price reactions today to earnings, and really out of all the ones you mentioned, which was amazing, I think the real extraordinary blow the doors off moment was Natera, who is just firing on all cylinders, right? But so is Illumina. I did a post earlier this week saying Illumina, by recent Illumina standards, had a great quarter, right? They're firing on all cylinders. They had much higher growth than they'd had. They pretty much exceeded all analyst expectations around most parameters. But then this morning, so Natera announced last night, like you said, and this morning Natera was up, stock was up about 20%, and Illumina's was just floating down by 1%, right? So maybe Illumina's biggest customer, Natera, with a huge reliance on sequencing, right? Sequencing, low-cost sequencing completely enables MRD, and that's the test that they keep on primarily doing so well at. And so they have this great quarter, and yet Illumina fades down, right? Whereas you would, I guess, intuitively, and I think rationally, expect that with a phenomenal quarter of one of your biggest customers, you're likely to go up because of the dependency there. But a couple of things have happened, right? The value is accruing clearly, by definition here, to Natera, and Illumina is now in a very, very competitive environment around sequencing. And sure, they still have a huge installed base, and they still have a big portion of the market, though according to some analyst predictions, it's come down from about 90% of bases to around 67%, which is a big change over the last couple of years. But I think that, to my mind, the key is they've lost pricing power, right? They've got Ultima, they've got Roche coming up. Their ASPs were down a bit this quarter, despite all the good news. And I think that's the big difference, that once upon a time when they had let's call it a stronger monopoly, they pretty much just set the price of sequencing. And I think it's pretty clear, particularly with Ultima coming in the last few years, where Illumina was really, I don't know, for a long time it floated around $500 a genome. Ultima came in, then announced the $100 genome and then the $80 genome. It means that there's a lot of negotiating power, right? Which it doesn't mean that Ultima is getting a huge amount of the market, but it weakens Illumina's position every time they're negotiating a deal with a customer.
Yeah, I wonder, because my question, I guess, is so Illumina, for sure, it's losing pricing pressure primarily around this idea of basically more competition, right, in that area. Even though potentially you could say the competitors are quite nascent, actually they're not that large yet, except for maybe Roche. It's the kind of anomaly, even though their sequencer,
it's a potential threat.
Yeah. Yes, exactly, right. So it's almost like the potential is really knocking down their value, whereas there are more MRD tests coming out, right? But it seems like Natera is just crushing it, right? I guess it seems like the moat that Natera has created, the app layer has created, or said in another way, that the diagnostic company app layer that's created, like a Guardant or a Natera, is more, it seems like, defensible, because there's arguably a lot of competition there too. Whereas for some reason the tool is not. I don't that baffles me, actually, Alex. Do you have any?
I do. It's
how do you
great
think about
point.
that? Yeah.
A great point. And I think, and I should know this better, but here's what I think happens. Um, Great execution by them, and they got big early fastest, right? Sorry for the bad English. And I think what happened in that market is now ordering is all electronic, and it's often in the MRD, right? And the doc, as I understand it, is looking at the MRD screen, and sorry, is looking at the patient screen, and if they want MRD, usually Natera is at the top of the list, right? They've negotiated, they've been out, they've negotiated deals with everyone. Might be a government, might be a health system. And I've talked to I talk regularly to oncologists about MRD because I'm so interested in it. And I've even had MRD. Oh, you mean Natera, right? It's synonymous with the word MRD, which is always a huge win for a company, right? If it's the Googleization of search. And so you have that on the one hand. And then an area I don't understand well is around all the clinical trials that are being run and the agreement or the inclusion into guidelines seem to happen not by a category by category approval, but by test approval, right? So Natera just got allowed, I think, in NCCN guidelines for bladder cancer, right? But that doesn't mean, I think it makes it easier for Guardant, right? It's like, well, you put in Natera, we're the same, but it sort of lets them extend that lead they already had. And then knocking down, and I think that's what's driving up the usage, they're knocking down the indications, and that expands their market like this. And everybody else is kind of in their shadow. And to some extent, they do break new ground ahead, but they're being so quick and they're being so effective and efficient that they're using it to increase their lead, I think, or at least maintain it, rather than just letting everyone coast along behind them and enable the market for them.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm hearing from you, Alex, is that there actually is a little bit more of almost like brand. Brand actually is a more of a moat here than say
Great point.
Illumina brand is, right? And maybe it's because I don't. This might be blasphemy, but it's almost like saying that doctors are less um, almost like less discerning, like in terms of the technology. They just care, they more about the brand. Whereas like a diagnostic company that uses different technologies, they can swap out technologies more readily, even though like the brand doesn't matter nearly as much. It seems like at least that's what market is saying to us potentially, right? That's one read of it. And of course, none of this is investing advice. I forgot to say that at the beginning. None of this is investing advice, just us having fun, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. I would argue it's brand, but it's brand not in the Coke versus Pepsi sense, but in the sense that it's the safe choice, not like a whim. It's like the thing that's getting approved the most. It's the you won't like Illumina, right? Nobody got fired for buying IBM, right? You're never going to get into trouble at MRD time for saying Natera. Now, I do know, because we live in a world of people immersed in the industry, that amongst people in the industry, they'll often recommend Personalis/Tempus because it's the more sensitive test, right? So the more I don't want to say informed, the more geeky one is, oh yeah, you should get Personalis Tempus, right? Why wouldn't you? It's you want, if you're doing MRD, you want the most sensitive test, right? And these approvals and indications, we all know, are kind of regulatory moves which lag well behind technology, right? I've got to run the trials. These are the big moves where you know that you're telling vast swaths of oncologists, here's the safe path for you, right? So they're kind of conservative and slow, as they should be, cautious, right? Whereas on the leading edge, you can go, oh yeah, it's not on the list, but if you just go on the website, you can order, Personalis or Tempus, right? Even if it's not in the EMR. But your regular oncologist isn't going to do that. But an oncologist at one of the leading cancer centers is far more likely, in my experience, to be ordering something other than Natera. And also using it for indications that are not yet announced. I was overhearing at a conference someone from one of the big cancer centers just saying, oh, we use MRD for everything all the time, right? It's just become I'm treating a cancer patient. Why wouldn't I want to constantly know the level of circulating tumor DNA in the thing? So to them, it's like, in a sense, and this is of course the big plan, does it replace or substitute or have a different role or an earlier role than scans, which obviously were the standard of care for the longest time? And that's the big tension debate that's going on right now. If my because it's not well written yet, it's still new in the medical sense, that the guidelines are written around cancers being detected in scans. And so if an MRD, you get a positive hit, there's not necessarily a set of directions on what to do, which is why often they're reluctant right now. Again, it's getting prescribed all the time in a big mainland cancer center, advanced cancer center, but much less so for the community oncologist, because he or she doesn't have a specific, in a lot of cases, a specific set of actions to take for something as broad as breast cancer, right? It's just kind of the unknown. It's not clear what to do if you get a positive MRD to the doc, and it's not clear what to do if you get a negative MRD. It's information, but it's information, it has one value, which is if the patient is clear and you get to convey it to the patient, it makes the patient super happy. That's a nice thing, right? Nobody thinks that's a negative. But does that mean you can take the low level of chemotherapy that you've got that patient on just in case, and they hate it because they want to be feeling better? They're immediately going to go, well, if there's no cancer, why do I have to take this horrible thing, right? So now you've started a whole set of questions down there. If you get a no cancer test, and if you get a cancer detected test, if it doesn't say in the NCCN guidelines what I should do, what's my liability, right? I can't do nothing. Or maybe I do. Maybe my liability is I need to wait until I see it on a scan, because then I know what to do with this patient. But right now, maybe I'll do more scans. And some doctors, I've seen very frustrated execs in MRD companies go, some doctors just won't take an action until it's on the scan, even if they get a positive MRD test back.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, I think there's another benefit that Natera has really relied on and built that brand. I'm with you on the brand angle, but again, this is not a Coke versus Pepsi. This is, a brand that came forward, got reimbursement really quickly relative to everyone else, started getting firsthand usage. What did they do with that cash? They went back and they did more studies, and they started stacking indications, right? So you could pick this for breast. You could pick that for another indication. Or you could just do the easy thing, which we know, it's in all of our natures. If I've got one that I know it's got this and this and this and this and this, it sounds like it's the leader, right? It makes the most sense. It may not be the most efficient. It may not have the best sensitivity, but you know what? It's gonna do it. And what that's led to, I think, is that aura of being really the MRD tool. And while it's not in any, it hasn't been in any guidelines until this past June, right? So the invasive bladder cancer indication, NCCN already has put it into the guidelines. And I think it's the actual test itself, the Natera test, right, is in the language, the coverage.
That's exactly right. It's an interesting dynamic. That's how it works, apparently. It's nope, what was in the trial? It's that test. And that makes sense, because otherwise, how do you know test X is as good as what was in the trial? That's some other connection that has to be made or proven. And the doc can't go, oh, yeah, I look at the stats. It looks like that test is as good as Natera or better. You're absolutely right. It's in the trial. It's the safe choice, both safe for the patient, safe for the doctor. I think,
and they're just running this flywheel, right? Just more and more data, more and more indications. It's a terrific execution, and they have made it a science, and I think that has really driven a lot of that brand sort of perception of Natera is the MRD brand.
Yep, totally agree. I certainly would never tell anyone not to take Natera. Like, it's Natera, the doctor says Natera. I'm like, take it. Take what the doctor says. Take what reimbursed, right? If you're wealthy and don't care about reimbursement, and then I go, well, yeah, do the Personalis test, right? Right now it's more sensitive, but that's a nice to have, not a must have.
Yeah, I would say as
not medical advice.
Yes, I was going to say
a big disclaimer.
Not a real doctor.
I'm also not a real doctor, but as a shareholder of Natera, everyone take a Natera test. That's my not medical
Not
advice
investment advice.
either, right? But actually, on that point, I maybe take it even more extreme, right? Besides the app company, like the test company, and then the tool company, could diagnostic companies become the largest? Basically, they take the vast majority or bigger share of the healthcare overall margin, as opposed
Mm.
to, like, say, the pharma companies. And the reason why I asked that question is the following. Just give everyone here some stats, and I'll pass over you first, Costas, for this. Is so Eli Lilly obviously killing it this year, right? 48% revenue growth on such a big number too, right? And
Yeah.
year to date stock growth 9%, right? Most of the companies in the pharma space, they grow, I mean, some of them grow 20%, 7%, AbbVie, Novartis 13%, at least in their from market cap perspective. Roche 11%, AstraZeneca went down about 9%, Novo Nordisk went down about 8%, right? So it's almost like they're making record profits from pharma's perspective, but it seems like the market aren't rewarding them as much as, say, the diagnostic companies, which have obviously massive growth off of a smaller base, but their market caps have all shot up quite a bit this year. I think probably Natera, I don't know exactly, probably around 50%. Guarded definitely at 60-70% right now, right? All time highs, right? Natera has made an all time high. So maybe thinking about it from that perspective, Costas, do you think there's a possibility that diagnostic companies, which generate the data, capture the data, right, about a person, over time
Mhm.
will gain more margin? Because let's say biosimilars become way more prevalent, right? Just not then it takes down the pharmaceutical companies a couple of pegs, right? Not that I'm saying I want that, but that potentially could happen, right? This dynamic of basically more competition in the almost like the pharmaceutical space, with China coming on a line as well, right?
Mhm.
With their biotechs. So is that ever a possibility? Because we probably wouldn't have not debated this 20 years ago or 15 years ago. That'd be crazy to say, right? But nowadays, what do you think about that, Costas?
So I think the if you take a look at how diagnostics were thought of in the past, it was a question of is this diagnostic valuable? And the question was, it's valuable if it can drive a clinical decision, right? So, which drug do I use? Which surgery do I do? Do I, whatever the clinical intervention was, it was, do I do this or not? And if it can't answer that, this is a useless test. Don't cover it. Don't pay for it. I mean, that's what it sort of used to look like. But today, I think it's a little bit different, because yes, it has to have an impact on your clinical decision making, but your clinical decision is so much more complex than, do I give this drug? Do I do X versus Y? It's, which of these drugs do I use? Do I use a different dose? Do I use different drug combinations? Does patient X need a different approach than patient Y? Even in GLP-1s, for example, with this multitude of pipeline coming down that Eli Lilly has, you're going to have multiple products coexisting, and potentially, one product will work for one patient better than another, or cause less side effects better than another, similar to what we've been seeing in the evolution in the oncology space. So if this is not just an oncology question anymore, but every indication is now going to require biomarkers to guide, which is the optimal approach for treating patients, whether it's branded medicines or biosimilars or good old generics. That is a tool then that helps you to manage the costs in your population, right? So rather than guessing, you now actually choose the appropriate thing, no matter where on the cost spectrum it lies, because you hopefully it leads to better outcomes. So if it can deliver on that promise, then I think diagnostics are really the tool that payers can use to figure out how to optimize the outcomes for the best cost. If it can't offer that, then I don't think that future is happening. I think that this is like a short term run up, just because it's a couple of new technologies, small base. and that's sort of the extent of it. Um, and if you're using it as a cost containment tool or a cost optimization tool, that's a different story. So to me, that's how I think of this from where did diagnostics fit in historically to where could they actually become the driver of interventions and care of the patient.
Yeah, actually, on that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex. Could jump in first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, completely agree with that. If you just look at it from a sort of a business mechanics point of view, I think it's very, very difficult for diagnostics to ever get to the scale of the pharma companies, right? Diagnostics companies build instruments, they have a razor blade model, but everything costs money. There's cold chains. You've got to get the blood to the, let's say blood to the diagnostic instrument, which needs to be in a clear lab. The business model for drugs in its general case, like GLP-1s, is unbelievable, right? And I think that's why you see Eli Lilly with $1 trillion valuation right now, right up there with Google and Apple, right? And the common thread there, well, not Apple, but these companies tend to have super high margin, almost virtual business models. You're really selling content, right? It just happens to be in a little pill, which is, in a little bottle in a consumer's home, right? So directly accessible, just like an app. It's right there in the home and they're consuming it. We take pills every night, blah, blah, blah. And so that model is just so scalable and so efficient and so high margin. And you can have many of them, right? You see that. You've got drug one, drug. I don't know, actually, the typical large pharma, how many like big drugs they have, but I assume dozens at least, right? And probably a long tail. Whereas, a company like Natera, who we're all thinking is like a super successful one. First of all, its market cap is around 40 billion versus $1 trillion. So, I mean, it's a long way to go. But then I would say that the model is so much more complex and has so much more, let's just call it complexity versus drug companies, which are complex in many ways, but its core thing, it's in the end, once you've done the R&D, once you've gone through the regulatory thing, it's like, bam, you've got these things that cost you nothing to make that are worth a huge amount of money.
Yeah, well, I guess I want to play a little bit devil's advocate here and just like take not the other side, but maybe a slightly different take on it, and then get your reaction to it, Alex. Actually, is let's say with various AI and robotics, right? Over time, that you can basically do a biosimilar super quickly. So you say it's like a content, right? Then what if you could just modify that very, very quickly, right? Or reproduce that very, very quickly. So arguably you could say, hey, how about patents and so forth? But, a lot of patents are kind of coming off. A lot of drugs are coming off patent nowadays, right? So you can rapidly make a biosimilar or some form of generic, right? And then so that should squeeze the margins of the big pharma companies. Whereas, say like a lab company, I'll use Garden as example. They have a test called Shield, which is a early screening test, right? Detects supposedly cancer earlier. In this case, it's specifically colorectal cancer earlier, right? And they're trying to make that all cancers in the future, right? Now, you can imagine that test being generating just as much revenue as a drug, right? As a mega drug. Let's say right now it's at $800 roughly to get reimbursed. For some of the drugs, some of the tests they do they don't get any reimbursement. Some they get reimbursement. So averages out to something like $800. ASP, average sales price, is about $800, right? Let's bring that down to $200, right? At some point in time. But let's say they're operating at cost them $50 to run, right? Now it costs them $200 to run. If it becomes 100 million people that take a test every single year, which is not unreasonable, I think, then that's $20 billion, right? If it's 200 million, that's like $40 billion. And I think what you said was interesting to me was this idea, and I haven't thought about it this way, was the lab infrastructure, right? That's in some ways a moat. It's like the logistics is a very, very heavy moat, right? Because then you can't just do a generic version of it. You have to like recreate the entire infrastructure to like provide the actual testing itself, right? And wouldn't that then say, the drugs are cheap but you need the data, then the companies that arguably create the data, hold the data, have longitudinal data on you, wouldn't that make them more kind of almost important?
Yeah, wonderful points. Yeah, I'm thinking of some big structural changes that are happening, at least particularly I'm seeing in the US, and I suspect earlier than in some other countries, around direct to consumer, right? That flips everything on its head, right? It's before I had to go to the doctor, I had to be sick and everything else. And now you're able to order things like the Grail test and now the Caris test and the exact test. You get to order them directly online and they sort of back it up with a doctor behind the screen, if you will, to make sure that there's a prescription written. But I tell you, I think this is a really interesting point. With a drug, the risk to the patient is pretty high, right? If I give them the wrong drug, it can kill them or make them sick in itself or interact with another drug. A really interesting benefit to diagnostics, which we don't tend to focus on, is there's a lot of FDA stuff about this, but in the end, it's pretty harmless. You're unlikely to hurt the person. Maybe a little puncture, right? It's very benign. And so I can see, not at the detailed regulatory level, but at the big societal level, that we're going to have a much lower bar for diagnostics. And again, US is interesting in the way that, for historical reasons, like dietary supplements are basically completely unregulated, right? There's this line between what's a drug and what's a supplement. You can see more and more diagnostics started more on that drug side, right? Tightly regulated, very formal. You go to the doctor, fill out a prescription, you go here and there. It's clearly moving the other way now. And I think that's caught everyone by surprise. Grail's the classic example. Grail was built, because it's been around a long time, on a very much, we'll do the clinical trial at the NHS, we'll get the FDA approval, it's going to be that. Now they're just selling a bunch of them direct to consumer because those DTC companies love it, because I was told they make about $200 on every Grail test. And they're used to selling stuff at cost, not a lot of money. It's a big enough chunk of money. It's not a $50 test, it's a $500 plus test, to your point. And so I think there are some really interesting long-term dynamics that could offset, let's call them, you used exactly the right word, the logistical disadvantage of diagnostics, that it's more performative. There's more steps in a process. The samples got to move around. It's not like I go down, a bottle of pills arrives in the mail and I consume them like that, right? That's a very, very efficient business model for pharma.
Yeah, and the other way I partially think about it is like, could China do it better, right? Like a drug, in many ways, people could say, "Oh, you could just make it in China, right? They do it like a fraction of the overall cost." But would you ever send your blood to China for testing? Not that I would have a necessary problem with it, but I would say I think a lot of people would be against that, because they would say, "Hey, my data, I don't want it to be in like the hands of like CCP." And, I'm not to get too political, right? But I could see a lot of people pushing back around that front. But transitioning a bit to something that's still in the diagnostic realm, right? But Alex said that at the very least, at the very minimum, you still have to maybe get a little puncture when you do a blood draw, right? But actually, recently, Kostas, I think you wanted to have a conversation with this company, but maybe at the grander scheme of things is maybe now some of these potential diagnostics don't are non-invasive completely, right? Like or so minimal that's not even a puncture, right? You specifically wanted to maybe use a Butterfly Network as a example of that. So maybe you want to let the audience know what this company does, and also like why you're so hyped on it.
Yeah. So, I think when we talked a little bit earlier about different companies, what could actually who's fundamentally sort of where's the growth coming from, so to speak. I think that we're at that point right now where there's growth and innovation happening at the same time, and what that means is some of that growth is going to go to new players, right? So the traditional folks that have been around forever, whether that's in sort of in vitro diagnostics or in this case in imaging, you're going to start to see it disperse to new players that are bringing something new to the table. And I think this one is a particularly interesting one in the imaging space. So the company is called Butterfly, and really the critical innovation is creating not creating the ultrasound tools the traditional way where you're taking individual sensors and you're putting them together, uh, into the actual hardware, but putting it directly onto the chips, right? So it fundamentally reduces the cost of manufacturing these sensors and the sort of the processing power that is required for the imaging behind them, right? That's in and of itself. I think you can almost think of this company as kind of the NVIDIA, so to speak, of ultrasounds. There are trade-offs, right? I mean, as always, you may not get the same level of sensitivity that you might otherwise get, but you get pretty much mostly the same effect, right? They've got their own series of products that they've put out there since 2020, I think, was their initial product offering. And the best way to think of it is you can replace that giant ultrasound cart with something that can be handheld. Right? That's the easiest way to think about the magnitude of the difference in being able to actually scale down that whole sensor unit and put the chip and the sensors together. So a number of other entrants have come along. So similar with NVIDIA, the other companies have sprung up using that technology. And I think there's two really interesting ones. And at the end of the day, they're ending up trying to do the same thing. So the first one is called Midjourney. And if you already are familiar with Midjourney, you're familiar probably because you could do text to photo using AI, right? I would like Santa Claus holding gifts in front of a Christmas tree. Well, great. It'll create the chubby old Saint Nick with like a bag full of presents in front of a traditional looking Christmas tree, just on a voice prompt. Well, these guys have done a little bit of a pivot. They've created Midjourney Medical. And what they're doing right now is using these sensors, and they get people to stand in like a tank of water, and they'll actually do a full body ultrasound scan. And the idea is that eventually this can actually replace an MRI, a full body MRI, but at a fraction of the cost, right? So right now they're at the point where they're offering this as a wellness offering in a couple of sites in San Francisco. So it's more of like a spa-like option. You can tick the wellness. Let me see what my body composition looks like, and stand in the tank. And this scan takes about 20 minutes, I think, is what I've heard so far. But what they're doing, the interesting thing is, while they're giving you your body composition numbers, they're banking data so that long term, their AI will be able to interpret the data and be able to do things like diagnose issues with your heart, with your liver, whatever, right? So it would be akin to getting a full body MRI at a fraction of the price. Right now, this is all out of pocket, but the long term sense is to turn this into a traditional diagnostic that you would use in a hospital, or potentially, because it's so much easier and lower cost, in smaller regional healthcare centers. So I think that's one company. The second company, started up by a couple of Google DeepMind engineers, are using the same technology, except they are mapping the vasculature in your brain. So, for anyone who's not familiar with ultrasound waves do not pass through air. That's why you got to put that little squirt of gel on it and direct contact with the body part that you're trying to scan. Or you can do it through water, which is what Midjourney Medical is doing. But these guys have figured out a way to go through bone, which is the other thing that you typically don't use ultrasound for. It's too solid. It's not going to get through, but they figured out how to do it. And so they're mapping the vasculature of the brain. And their stated goal is to create a sort of a telepathic human-computer interface. Very sci-fi, very interesting. Certainly turns people's heads. But the interesting thing is what they can really do potentially once they've collected enough data so that you have structure and function between vascular and the different regions of the brain, and how the brain is operating or what the brain is trying to do. So if you have activation in your frontal lobe versus your your cerebellum or whatever, it'll actually be able to identify what's happening, which is kind of what a functional MRI or a CT scan can actually do today. Again, at a fraction of the cost. So what they're doing right now is actually taking those scans, trying to feed data into their AI algorithm so that it can essentially replace these high cost tools. And really the underpinning strategy to, or the underpinning sort of catalyst for all this is this conversion of traditional sensors for ultrasound to sensor on a chip. So it's fascinating that this one new technology can catalyze, I think, a number of different use cases, and they're all at the stage right now of building their data set to be able to go to a real clinical offering as opposed to a wellness offering or a telepathic human interface to computers. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I just was fascinated by this, with this technological innovation could potentially result in.
Yeah, so maybe I'll pass it over to you, Alex, but maybe to make a similar point, but it's slightly different technology as well. So it's like the digitization of a lot of like, it's almost like these quote unquote digital biomarkers, right? This ultrasound capturing the information. Actually, I don't know if Alex, if you're familiar with ultrasound technology, maybe you can actually explain it as well, because this is kind of interesting that they're using semiconductors as opposed to like, I guess, the traditional ones. But the idea is that you're creating these almost like digital markers, right, about the person. And a larger point to this is like very recently, Eli Lilly actually made an investment into a company called Aura. So the folks that make the Aura ring, right, which then measures like your pulse, for your heart rate, and so forth, right? And then of course now, very recently, Dexcom has just had a fantastic quarter as well, and they measure glucose in their like continuous glucose monitoring, and they have a product actually she's consumer facing called Stello as well that I really want to try it out. But anyways, I haven't done that yet. So I'm curious what your thoughts around this idea, this whole concept of almost like digitizing. You're creating more digital markers, and again, it's generating data. That's your moat, and you're doing something with it. In this case, I guess potentially telepathy, which is awesome. I love that idea.
Yeah, it's I see the huge benefits and some risks there, as with everything like this. I was thing I refer to as I do a hike every day to work out, and if I don't take my Apple Watch and I don't get my VO2 max number off my hike, it's like it didn't happen. Like the value to the hike for me is getting the numbers on my watch. I will literally walk back to the house and pick up my watch because I just know how my brain works. And then every now and again, I upload the whole thing to all my Apple Health data, goes up to Claude. Also has all my blood work, which I get for 20 years. I've had really thorough blood work done, and so like everything's in a trajectory. I had an MRI this week. This was fun on my ankle because of the hiking, and it turns out you can get a DVD of your MRI right there, and it says all that just for your doctor, right? Hand to your doctor only. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to go home, and fed it into Claude Code. It did all the slicing, went through, did an incredibly detailed diagnosis of it, right? So I'm really eager to get the actual radiologist diagnosis in the next couple of days and see how Claude did. And so I think there's many elements to this. There's the, what's the thing, hacking, right? So you got the hacking issue, which is now huge because now you've got an AI to give you at least a plausible diagnosis of nearly any digital input whatsoever, whether it's coming out of your watch, whether it's coming back from the doctor, or if it's your blood thing. It's just amazing. So you got that side. The scanning is super interesting, but it's also echoed by what's happening with, very fancy healthcare, which is getting full body scans on MRIs and using that for how am I doing, right? And as we all know, there's a lot of false positives. What's that nodule, right? What's that density item? And So it's great that the idea that ultrasound technology could be, and by the way, I should know, but I haven't looked, but I would guess that the ultrasound technology is from a technology called MEMS, which is a way of building mechanical devices on chips. And an ultrasound you need to obviously generate a signal and detect a signal. And it's now become very standard to build microphones and loudspeakers at the chip level. You're basically building things and you're etching underneath them. And so you can create little tiny, like 1 micron squares that are balanced on tiny little pivot points. And so sound, for example, can vibrate that. And then you can it's easy to build an electrical circuit to measure the capacitive change as that piece moves up and down. So you can build these, obviously very inexpensive, you can't build large things usually because it's set by the size of the reticle of the chip, which is, that's called well under an inch by an inch. But you can fit a huge number of sensors into that. So if you can work out a methodology for dealing with that density of sensors, you can build pretty extraordinary things, obviously, around that. A lot of experiments in using chips and embedding chips in people to measure things, right? That's another thing. You build a chip which is really just a biological sensing chip, and that's been a long-time goal of a lot of companies. Hasn't come to fruition yet.
Yeah, but I'm with you there, Alex. I don't know if you see this sometimes on the memes, right? Like Strava is an app that people in the kind of exercise community use for tracking your runs or your swimming, whatever it is the distance, right? And people the meme is if it's not on Strava, it didn't happen. So it's similar to what you said about your Apple Watch,
That's
right?
exactly it.
Yeah. So
well,
I know
Q is one of the frustrations with exercise
okay.
for me, which is you exercise doesn't pay back immediately, right? That's the problem. You do the exercise and it's all negative for me. It's just all a bunch of energy, boredom, blah, right? And you go, well, for the long-term health of Alex, I'm going to sacrifice right now. But at least if you get a little number out of it, it feels more real. And VO2 max is perfect for me because if I work out really hard, like it just gradually climbs. And if I miss 3 days, it goes, it's kind of a dreadful treadmill, pardon the pun, because it's really sensitive to what you've been doing in terms of levels of exercise.
Yeah. No, I agree. Actually, I never thought about it that way. That your watch gives you instant, almost like gratification. The data gives you instant gratification, which is kind of interesting. But speaking about gratification around, I know we got to end things now, but I think Kostas talked about Santa Claus, right? And talked about Santa Claus being a big gentleman, right? Did you know that was not the case, actually? That back in, I think, the 1900s, that was not the case. Like Santa Claus was like almost like a small, skinny little like elf, right? And it was Coca-Cola, I learned on a podcast, that made the current version of Santa Claus, right? Because they wanted someone big, and they made it red, right? Because you could see more red, right? So our idea of what Santa Claus looks like right now is actually a conception from Coca-Cola, which is crazy. I never thought. I was like, wow, that. When we talked about people changing culture, changing perception, Coca-Cola did that. That's just amazing. I never knew that until part of this podcast call.
And you have solved. It's a great point to end on. You have solved one of the biggest contradictions in life for me, which is how does the big guy get down the chimney? It was probably a little skinny guy that went down the chimney, right? Broke the deficit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny that way.
That was before he started drinking all that Coke.
on that note, we're gonna end things because I know we're over time. So everyone's been very gracious with the time. So thank you very much, Alex, for joining us again. We gotta figure out a new intro where we better incorporate.
It ain't broken, don't fix it.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure one out. But thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to comment below, like, subscribe, and again, thank you very much everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Kostas.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Very fun.